My name is Cameron Rodriguez, and I'm 28 years old. What happened when my parents opened a manila envelope I handed them during our Sunday family dinner 3 months ago is something that completely transformed their understanding of real estate success, financial strategy, and which child's had actually been building generational wealth while the other was accumulating debt. Picture this. My mother and father confidently lecturing me about the benefits of homeownership while mocking my wasteful rental payments, only to freeze in complete shock when they saw the property deed showing I owned not just my renta L apartment, but the entire 24-unit building they were sitting in. You see, that deed wasn't just a piece of paper, it was proof that, while they'd been celebrating my brother Tyler's house purchase as a sign of adult responsibility and financial wisdom, their irresponsible daughter had been quietly building a real estate portfolio worth $3.80 million. The same parents who had spent 2 years using Tyler's mortgage as evidence of his superior life choices were now staring at documentation that I owned more property than both of them combined, including the building where Tyler rented his starter home for my property management company. Before we dive into this incredible story of financial assumptions getting completely destroyed, I need to know, where in the world are you watching this right now? Drop your country and what time it is there in the comments. Are you catching this during your morning coffee while dreaming about real estate success? Or are you winding down your evening with a story about family judgment, backfiring spectacularly? And if you've ever been criticized by family for renting instead of buying, give this video a thumbs up. You're about to see why traditional home ownership advice isn't always the smartest financial strategy. Quick question before we jump into this family drama. Have you ever been made to feel like you were making poor financial decisions by people who didn't actually understand your bigger strategy? Because this story is going to show you exactly how dangerous it can be to judge someone's choices without knowing the full picture of what they're building. Let me take you back to the beginning of this family real estate saga, which started 2.5 years ago when my brother Tyler announced he was buying his first house, and my parents began using his decision as a measuring stick for everyone else's financial maturity. Tyler had just turned 30 and had been saving for a down payment while living at home with our parents for 3 years after college. His announcement that he'd found a 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood and qualified for a mortgage was met with a kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for major life achievements like graduations or job promotions. Tyler's finally taking the step into real home ownership, Dad announced during our monthly family dinner, his voice carrying the pride of a parent whose child had reached an important milestone. No more throwing money away on rent, he's building equity and investing in his future. It's such a responsible decision, Mom added, beaming at Tyler while he described the house hunting process and mortgage approval journey. Homeownership is such an important part of building financial stability. I sat there listening to their celebration of Tyler's house purchase, while mentally calculating that his mortgage payment, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs would total about $2,400 monthly for a property he'd paid $280,000 to acquire with a $56,000 down payment that had taken him 5 years to save. Cameron, you should think about following Tyler's example, Dad said, turning his attention to me with the instructional tone he used when dispensing financial advice. You're 28 years old and still renting that apartment downtown. It's time to start thinking about building equity instead of paying someone else's mortgage. My living situation works well for my current needs, I replied diplomatically, knowing that explaining my actual real estate strategy would require revealing information I wasn't ready to share with family members who had never shown interest in my financial planning. But you're literally throwing away $1,500 every month, Mom said with the exaggerated concern parents use when they think their children are making obviously poor decisions. That's $18,000 annually that you'll never see again. Homeownership isn't just about monthly payments, Tyler added, clearly enjoying his new role as the family's real estate expert. It's about building long-term wealth through property appreciation and mortgage principal payments. Exactly, Dad agreed. Tyler understands that renting is basically paying someone else to build equity while you get nothing except a place to sleep. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Tyler explaining his house buying process while my parents used his decision as evidence that he had superior understanding of financial planning and adult responsibility compared to his sister, who was still renting despite being old enough to know better. What my family didn't know, what they had never bothered to discover despite 2.5 years of these conversations, was that My approach to real estate was completely different from Tyler's traditional homeownership model, and was generating returns that made his equity building look insignificant by comparison. I wasn't just renting an apartment, I was strategically building a real estate investment portfolio while maintaining the flexibility and cash flow advantages that traditional homeownership would have eliminated. My rental apartment was actually a unit in a 24-unit building that I had purchased 18 months earlier for $2.80 million, using a combination of my savings, investor partnerships, and strategic financing that generated positive cash flow. From day one. But instead of living there as an owner-occupant, I had structured the purchase so that I rented from my own property management company, allowing me to maintain the tax advantages and flexibility of being a tenant while building equity as the building's owner. The strategy was something I'd learned from studying commercial real estate investment, where successful investors often separate their living situations from their wealth-building activities to maximize both lifestyle flexibility and tenant returns. More importantly, the building purchase had been so successful that I'd been able to acquire 2 additional properties over the following year, a 12-unit apartment complex and a small commercial building, bringing my total real estate portfolio to 3 properties worth $3.80 million that generated $42,000 monthly in rental income after all expenses. But I had kept this information completely private, partly because I preferred focusing on building wealth rather than discussing it, and partly because I'd learned that family members who didn't understand investment strategy often responded to financial success with criticism rather than celebration. The monthly family dinners became increasingly uncomfortable, as Tyler's homeownership was repeatedly used as evidence of his superior financial planning, while my continued renting was treated as proof that I lacked the maturity and foresight necessary for building long-term wealth. "Cameron, you're almost 30 years old," Dad said during one particularly pointed conversation. "Don't you think it's time to stop living like a college student and start making adult financial decisions?" "What specifically do you consider adult financial decisions?" "Building equity instead of throwing money away on rent. Create a stable foundation for your future instead of just paying for temporary housing. Tyler's already built more wealth in 18 months of homeownership than you have in 6 years of renting," Mom added with the statistical confidence parents use when they think they're presenting irrefutable evidence. The irony was incredible. While they were using Tyler's $280,000 house purchase as evidence of wealth building, I was managing a $3.80 million real estate portfolio that generated more passive income monthly than Tyler earned at his full-time job. But the conversation that finally pushed me to reveal the truth about my real estate situation came 6 months ago, when my parents announced they were considering helping Tyler with his next property purchase, while simultaneously lecturing me about my continued wasteful rental payments. Time to pause here, because what I'm about to tell you about Tyler's investment property purchase, and my parents' reaction when they discovered who was actually financing it, is absolutely mind-blowing. If you're loving this story about family assumptions getting completely destroyed by hidden real estate success, smash that subscribe button right now and hit the notification bell. We post content like this every week about financial stereotypes and the moment when people who think they understand money realize they've been completely wrong about someone's wealth-building strategy. While you're hitting that subscribe button, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are right now, and have you ever had family members give you financial advice based on assumptions that were completely wrong? The psychology behind people judging others' money decisions without knowing the full story is fascinating. Tyler's announcement that he wanted to buy a rental property as an investment came during a family dinner that was supposed to celebrate his first year of homeownership. He had been researching real estate investment and decided that purchasing a second property would accelerate his wealth-building timeline. "I've been looking at rental properties as a way to generate passive income and build equity in multiple assets simultaneously," Tyler explained to our parents, who listened with the same enthusiasm they'd shown for his initial house purchase. "Say, Sajay. That's such smart thinking," Mom said approvingly. "Multiple properties mean multiple sources of equity building." Tyler's really understanding how to make money work for him, Dad added with obvious pride in his son's financial sophistication. "I found this great duplex that would generate enough rental income to cover most of the mortgage payment," Tyler continued. "The numbers work out really well for building long-term wealth." "How much are you looking to invest?" Dad asked. "The property is listed at $320,000, so I need about $64,000 for the down payment plus closing costs. That's a substantial investment, Mom acknowledged. Do you have sufficient savings for that kind of purchase? Not quite yet, but I was hoping we could discuss family assistance with the down payment. Maybe a loan that I could pay back over time from the rental income. My parents exchanged the look they used when considering major financial decisions that would affect family resources and relationships. We could potentially help with part of the down payment, Dad said carefully. Real estate investment is exactly the kind of wealth-building activity we want to support. Meanwhile, Mom said, turning her attention to me with renewed criticism, Cameron is still throwing away money on rent instead of building any equity or investment portfolio. The contrast was being drawn explicitly. Tyler was a sophisticated investor who deserved family financial support for his real estate ventures, while Cameron was financially immature and needed guidance about basic wealth-building principles. But what made this conversation particularly ironic was that I knew exactly which duplex Tyler was describing, because it was one of 12 rental units in a building I had purchased 8 months earlier as my third investment property. Tyler's asking our parents to help him buy a rental property from my portfolio, without any of them knowing that his target investment was already owned by his sister, whose financial strategy they'd been dismissing as irresponsible. Tyler, can you tell me more about this duplex? Where is it located exactly? It's on Maple Street, part of a small complex that's been really well maintained. The current owner is apparently some investment company, but the property manager says they're motivated to sell individual units. Maple Street. My property. Manager had been marketing individual units from my 12-unit building to attract investors who preferred smaller-scale real estate purchases over commercial property acquisition. Tyler was essentially asking our parents to help him buy property from me, while they simultaneously criticized me for not building a real estate portfolio like his. Have you made an offer on this property yet? I asked. I'm planning to submit an offer this weekend, assuming Mom and Dad can help with the financing. Tyler, before you submit that offer, I think there's something you should know about the property ownership. What do you mean? I pulled my phone and opened the property management app that showed real-time updates on all my rental properties, including the Maple Street building Tyler was hoping to purchase from. The investment company that owns this duplex, I said, showing him the screen, is actually my company. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced during family dinners. Tyler stared at my phone screen, reading and rereading the property information, while my parents tried to process what I'd just revealed. Your company? Dad said weakly. I own the building Tyler wants to buy a unit from. It's part of my real estate investment portfolio. But you rent an apartment, Mom said, as if my rental status somehow made real estate ownership impossible. I rent strategically while building wealth through property investment. Different approach from Tyler's owner-occupied homeownership, but arguably more effective for generating passive income and portfolio growth. How many properties do you own? Tyler asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 buildings. 48 rental units, total. About $3.8 million in total property value. The numbers hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about my financial situation and investment sophistication. $3.8 million? Dad repeated. Current market value based on recent commercial property appraisals. The portfolio generates about $42,000 monthly in rental income after all expenses. Monthly? Mom whispered. Real estate investment at this scale generates substantial cash flow when managed properly. Tyler was still processing that his investment opportunity was actually a chance to buy property from his sister's existing portfolio. Cameron, why didn't you tell us you owned real estate investment properties? Because every time we've discussed real estate, you've used my rental status as evidence that I don't understand wealth building or property investment. But WWE were trying to encourage you to build equity. You were criticizing my strategy without understanding what that strategy actually involved. The conversation continued for another hour, with my parents asking questions about how I'd finance instead the property purchases, how the rental income was managed, and how I'd learned about commercial real estate investment, while they assumed I was financially naive. But the most revealing part was Tyler's reaction to discovering that his investment target was already owned by someone he'd been considering financially irresponsible. Cameron, if you own rental properties worth almost $4 million, why do you still rent your own apartment? Because separating my living situation from my investment strategy gives me maximum flexibility and cash flow optimization. Why, Mom? Owner-occupied properties tie up capital and limit mobility in ways that can restrict investment growth. But you're paying rent to live somewhere instead of building equity in your personal residence. Tyler, I'm collecting rent from 4 tie 8 units while paying rent on 1. The net cash flow heavily favors my approach over traditional homeownership. The math was undeniable, but it represented a complete reversal of the financial hierarchy my family had constructed over the past 2 years. Instead of Tyler being the sophisticated real estate investor and Cameron being the financially irresponsible renter, the reality was that Cameron had built substantial wealth through strategic property investment, while Tyler had barely begun accumulating equity through traditional homeownership. But I wasn't finished revealing the full scope of how their assumptions about my financial situation had been wrong. Hold up, I need to pause the story here because what I showed them next completely shattered not just their assumptions about my rental situation, but about Tyler's smart house purchase decision. If you're enjoying this financial plot twist, make sure you're subscribed because the next revelation about who actually owns Tyler's house is going to blow your mind. Real quick, what country are you watching from, and have you ever discovered that someone you thought was financially struggling was actually much more successful than you realized? Drop it in the comments because the psychology of financial assumptions is absolutely fascinating. After my parents had spent an hour processing that their financially irresponsible daughter owned a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio, I decided it was time to reveal the complete picture of my investment strategy, including the art that would redefine their understanding of Tyler's homeownership success. There's something else about my real estate investments that you should probably know, I said, pulling out a manila folder I'd brought specifically for this conversation. More properties? Dad asked, still looking overwhelmed by the scope of what I'd already revealed. Not more properties, a different perspective on a property you're already familiar with. I opened the folder and removed a property deed, placing it on the dining room table where everyone could see the official documentation. Tyler, do you recognize this address? I asked, pointing to the legal description on the deed. Tyler leaned forward to read the document, and I watched his face change as he processed what he was seeing. This is Undale. This is my address. This is the deed to my house. That's correct. And if you look at the current property owner listed on that deed, you'll see why your mortgage payments have been so affordable. Tyler read the owner information aloud. Rodriguez Holdings LLC Torto. Then he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen from him before. Cameron, do you own my house? I own the house you live in. You're not building equity through mortgage payments. You're paying rent to my property management company, which then makes mortgage payments to the bank on a loan I control through my LLC. The silence that followed was absolute. My parents stared at the deed, then at Tyler, then at me, trying to understand how their son's proud homeownership had actually been a rental arrangement with his sister's investment company. But I have a mortgage, Tyler said weakly. I make payments to the bank, you make payments to my property management company, which holds the mortgage on the property and manages all tenant relationships. It's a common arrangement for investors who want to provide housing while building equity through property ownership. Tyler's been renting from me this whole time? Mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For 2.5 years. The house he thought he was buying was actually purchased by my investment company, then made available to him through a rent-to-own arrangement that he interpreted as traditional homeownership. But we celebrated his house purchase, Dad said, confusion evident in his voice. We were so proud that he'd achieved homeownership. You celebrated what you thought was his house purchase? Tyler was excited about having his own place and assumed that making monthly payments to live there meant he was building equity. I never corrected the misunderstanding because it wasn't relevant to either his housing satisfaction or my investment returns. Tyler was reading through the deed again, trying to understand how his home ownership pride had been based on a M2. His understanding of his actual housing arrangement. Cameron, why would you let me think I owned this house if I was actually just renting from you? Because your housing satisfaction had nothing to do with the ownership structure. You wanted a stable place to live with predictable monthly costs, and that's exactly what you got. Whether you called it homeownership or a rental didn't change the quality of your housing experience. But all this time, you've been listening to us praise my financial responsibility for buying a house, when I was actually just paying rent to your company. I've been listening to you celebrate achieving exactly what you wanted, a stable living situation with monthly payments you can't afford. The ownership details were administrative, not emotional. The conversation was revealing layers of misunderstanding that had been building for over 2 years. My parents had used Tyler's house purchase as evidence of his financial maturity, while criticizing my rental status, without understanding that both Tyler and I were actually tenants in properties I owned. But Mom was beginning to process the broader implications of what this meant about their financial advice and family dynamics. Cameron, if you own Tyler's house and your own apartment building, plus 2 other investment properties, why have you let us lecture you about the importance of home ownership? Because your advice was based on assumptions about my financial situation, rather than questions about my actual strategy. Correcting those assumptions would have required revealing information about my investment portfolio that I preferred to keep private. But we spent 2 years using Tyler's homeownership as an example of superior financial planning. Why? We've spent 2 years celebrating that Tyler found housing he was happy with and could afford. The fact that his happiness was based on renting rather than owning doesn't change the validity of his satisfaction with the arrangement. Tyler was still processing the revelation that his proud homeownership had been a rental arrangement he'd misunderstood. Cameron, do other people know that I'm actually renting this house instead of owning it? The property management company knows, obviously. Your neighbors probably don't care about the ownership details. Your satisfaction with the housing arrangement is what matters, not whether you're building equity or paying rent. But I've been telling people I'm a homeowner. You've been telling people you live in a house and make monthly payments. That privilege. Both of those things are true regardless of the ownership structure. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, with my parents asking detailed questions about my real estate investment strategy, how I'd managed to acquire multiple properties without their knowledge, and how my approach to wealth building compared to traditional homeownership models they'd always advocated. But the most important outcome wasn't their understanding of my financial success. It was their recognition that their assumptions about responsible financial behavior had been based on incomplete information about both their children's actual situations. Cameron, we owe you an apology, Dad said as we were finishing dinner. We've been criticizing your rental situation and praising Tyler's home ownership, without understanding that you were actually the property owner in both cases. You don't need to apologize for not knowing information I chose not to share. But you might want to consider asking questions before making assumptions about other people's financial strategies. We will. Cameron, can we ask why you decided to reveal all this information tonight? Because Tyler was about to ask you for money to buy property from my portfolio, while you simultaneously criticized me for not building the real estate investments I'd already accumulated. It seemed like a good time for everyone to understand the actual situation. 6 months have passed since that dinner conversation, and the family dynamic around financial success has changed completely. Instead of Tyler being celebrated as the real estate expert while I was criticized for renting, my parents now ask questions about investment strategy and acknowledge that wealth building can take forms they don't immediately recognize. Tyler's reaction to learning about his rental situation was initially embarrassing, but he's come to appreciate that his housing satisfaction was never dependent on ownership status. He's happy with his living situation regardless of the administrative details. More importantly, he started asking questions about real estate investment rather than assuming that traditional homeownership is the only path to building wealth through property. But the most significant change has been in how my parents discuss financial success and responsibility. They've learned that questioning assumptions is more valuable than giving advice based on incomplete information. Sometimes the most powerful way to change people's perspectives isn't through arguments or explanations. It's through revealing information that forces them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about a situation. The deed that made their faces go pale wasn't just property documentation, it was proof that financial success often happens in ways that aren't immediately visible to people who make assumptions based on surface appearances. Before we wrap up this incredible story of real estate assumptions getting completely destroyed, I'm genuinely curious. What time zone are you in right now, and have you ever had people give you financial advice without understanding your tool strategy? The number of people who confuse lifestyle choices with wealth-building capability is absolutely mind-blowing. And if this story reminded you that rental payments aren't always throwing money away and that property ownership can take strategic forms that aren't immediately obvious, please share it with someone who might need that perspective. You never know who's currently being criticized for unconventional financial choices that are actually more sophisticated than their critics realize. What real estate advice have you received from people who didn't understand your actual investment strategy? What assumptions have family members made about your financial decisions without knowing the full picture? Thank you for watching this journey of family financial assumptions meeting reality. Whether you're starting your morning in London dreaming about property investment or ending your evening in Sydney thinking about wealth building strategy. I'm grateful you experienced this revelation with me. If you've ever been criticized for renting by people who didn't understand that you might actually own more real estate than they do, you're definitely not alone. Sometimes the most successful investors are the ones who separate their living situations from their wealth building strategies in ways that aren't immediately obvious to traditional homeownership advocates. Make sure to drop hidden wealth in the comments if you believe that people's financial strategies are often more sophisticated than their lifestyle choices might suggest. And while you're commenting, tell me what country you're watching from. I love seeing our global community and how universal these financial assumption patterns really are. Don't forget to subscribe and absolutely ring that notification bell because we share stories like this every week about financial misconceptions, real estate success, and those incredible moments when people who thought they understood money realize they've been completely wrong about someone's wealth building approach. Final question: do you think I should have corrected my family's assumptions about Tyler's home ownership earlier, or was it better to let the misunderstanding continue until it became relevant to a larger conversation? I'm genuinely interested in your thoughts about when to reveal financial information and when to keep investment strategies private. Remember, people's living situations don't always reflect their wealth building strategies, and sometimes the most successful investors are the ones who maintain flexibility by separating their personal housing from their property portfolio. When someone criticizes your financial choices, they might be revealing more about their assumptions than your actual capabilities.